Let's dive right in. Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're unpacking some truly unique source material. We're looking at a text published back in 2012 that analyzes Japan's political and economic response to the devastating 2011 Great East Japan earthquake. But here's the catch. It approaches this through a highly unusual lens. It's a book by Ryuho Okawa that actually claims to channel the spirit of the legendary macroeconomist John Maynard Keynes. So whether you're into economics, crisis management, or just fascinated by how spiritual movements interpret public policy, this is an absolutely captivating framework to explore. Here is our quick roadmap for today. 1. Earthquake reconstruction and tax hikes. 2. TEPCO and maintaining nuclear power. 3. Preparing for the next crisis. And 4. Recommending Keynesian investment. For this explainer, we are going to focus entirely on Chapter 1 of the text, which is aptly titled Economic Policy for Disaster Recovery. The author is deeply focused on the intersection of disaster response and macroeconomic theory, and we're going to decode exactly how this spiritual interpretation of Keynes views national rebuilding. Section 1. Earthquake reconstruction and tax hikes. Rebuilding without taxing. Now, following the massive 2011 disaster, the immediate, obvious question for the Japanese government was how to actually fund this monumental rebuilding effort. The Japanese government's approach at the time leaned heavily into floating tax increases to cover those massive recovery costs. But the source takes a decidedly harsh stance against this. The channeled spirit of Keynes vehemently argues that the government was essentially just using the disaster as a convenient political excuse to push through long-desired tax hikes. And the rhetoric here doesn't pull any punches. The text literally calls the government's stance, quote, cowardly. The core argument is that slapping heavier taxes on a traumatized, economically vulnerable population during a time of national mourning is just fundamentally bad macroeconomic policy, hiding behind a mask of necessity. So, if the text completely shuts down the government's fiscal response, you might be wondering, how does it evaluate the response to the concurrent nuclear crisis? Well, this is where the material takes a highly controversial turn, pivoting right from tax policy into corporate responsibility. Section 2. TEPCO and maintaining nuclear power. Defending nuclear energy. At a time when domestic and global media were relentlessly criticizing TEPCO for the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, this text steps in with a robust defense. It actively highlights the intense, frontline struggles of the company's workers during the peak of the meltdown. On top of that, it heavily critiques the journalism of the time, arguing the media was just looking for a scapegoat and unfairly shifting all societal and governmental blame onto the company. Because of this perspective, the source strongly pushes back against reactionary calls to completely abolish nuclear power in Japan. And this advocacy isn't just about keeping the lights on. The author insists on building new, highly safe nuclear plants to secure independent energy resources, directly tying this capability to Japan's broader national defense strategy. The view here is that abandoning nuclear energy would leave the nation incredibly geopolitically vulnerable. Now, this intense focus on vulnerability brings up a really important question. Beyond energy security, how does the text view Japan's physical readiness for future disasters? Let's transition from looking backward at the 2011 response to looking forward at what this text predicts is coming next. Section 3. Preparing for the next crisis. Predicting future threats. This is where the source shifts gears from a retrospective economic critique into the realm of futuristic, spiritual disaster prophecy. The text uses some very vivid, specific terminology to categorize these national threats. It refers to the devastating 2011 earthquake and tsunami as a water attack. But then it issues this stark warning. The nation must urgently prepare for what it calls fire attacks. In this context, fire attacks are predicted to be massive volcanic eruptions or even foreign missile strikes. The author insists that defending against these specific threats absolutely has to be the new national priority. To survive these predicted fire attacks, the text actually proposes some surprisingly concrete technological solutions. It argues there's an absolute pressing need for systems that can rapidly evacuate massive amounts of people. Specifically, it calls for the heavy development of advanced helicopters and the widespread deployment of VTOL, or vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. So rather than just pouring concrete for higher seawalls, the focus shifts entirely to rapid airborne mobilization. Okay, but think about the massive logistical puzzle this creates. If the text completely rejects tax hikes, like we talked about in Section 1, but at the same time demands the creation of an expansive, cutting-edge aerospace defense network, What exactly is the proposed economic path forward? How on earth do we pay for all this? Section 4, recommending Keynesian investment, funding through growth. This is exactly where the core economic theory of the historical John Maynard Keynes comes back into play, channeled through this spiritual framework. To really understand the solution here, we have to talk about the multiplier effect. It's a foundational Keynesian economic concept. The basic idea is that bold initial government investment, like, say, spending billions on a brand new network of VTOL aircraft, doesn't just drain public funds. It creates jobs, which puts money in people's pockets, which they then spend at local businesses. That ultimately leads to a proportionally much larger increase in overall economic income and recovery. So, tying it all together, the core thesis of Chapter 1 is remarkably clear. First, absolutely reject the idea of using disaster recovery as an excuse for taxation, because that just stifles the damaged economy. Second, immediately implement bold, large-scale government investments into national security and advanced disaster tech. And third, trust that utilizing the multiplier effect from those massive initial investments will organically drive genuine economic expansion. Which brings us to our wrap-up. What we've explored today is a deeply unconventional intersection of ideas. We're looking at traditional macroeconomic theory, specifically Keynesian stimulus, blended with a robust corporate defense of nuclear energy, all framed within a spiritual disaster prophecy about water and fire attacks. It is, without a doubt, a highly unique blueprint for national survival. I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. Does framing traditional economic and defense policies through a spiritual lens fundamentally change how a nation might view disaster recovery? Whether you look at this text as a religious curiosity or a provocative critique of fiscal austerity, it undeniably forces us to examine the mechanics of national rebuilding from a completely different angle.